believed it had conquered poverty forever. The economy boomed with a ferocity the world had never seen. Factories produced automobiles, radios, refrigerators. New machines rolled off assembly lines every hour. Workers earned wages that would have seemed impossible to their parents. Cities grew upward. Skyscrapers pierced the clouds. The future looked infinite. The stock market became the engine of national dreams. Ordinary Americans bought shares on credit. Shoeshine boys gave stock tips. Housewives invested their savings. Barbers offered market advice between haircuts. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed year after year. Newspapers declared that prosperity was permanent. Economists called it the new era. Nobody questioned whether it could end. Wall Street transformed American culture. Wealth became visible and celebrated. Men in expensive suits rode in long black automobiles. Women wore silk dresses and diamonds. Department stores sold luxury goods to the middle class. Advertising told Americans what to want. Banks told Americans how to borrow. Credit made tomorrow's money available today. The entire economy ran on borrowed time without anyone knowing it. Corruption ran deep beneath the gleaming surface. The decade began with prohibition, the nationwide ban on alcohol. The government outlawed drinking and accidentally created organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone built empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They bribed police captains, judges, and mayors. They ran speakeasies that served thousands of customers nightly. The law existed on paper. In the streets, gangsters made the real rules. Politicians sold themselves openly. The Teapot Dome scandal revealed that government officials had secretly sold America's oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. The Secretary of the Interior went to prison, but he was just one man who got caught. The system of corruption ran far deeper. City governments across America operated as criminal enterprises disguised as public service. Votes were bought, contracts were rigged, justice was for sale. But ordinary Americans felt none of this darkness. They danced the Charleston, they listened to jazz, they went to silent movies and then to talkies. Babe Ruth hit home runs. Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. Heroes provided distraction from everything that mattered. The decade roared forward on pure momentum. Nobody wanted to hear warnings. The party had to keep going. And then, on a Tuesday in October 1929, it stopped. October 24, 1929, Black Thursday. The stock market began to shake. Prices fell sharply in the morning. Bankers gathered and pooled resources to stop the panic. They thought they could hold the line. For a few hours, the market stabilized. People exhaled. Maybe the worst was over. It was not over. It had barely begun. 5 days later, on Black Tuesday, October 29, the market collapsed completely. 16 million shares traded in a single day. Prices fell so fast that the ticker tape machines could not keep up. Investors watched fortunes evaporate in hours. Men who had been millionaires in the morning were bankrupt by afternoon. The screaming on the trading floor could be heard on the street outside. The crash exposed everything that had been hidden. Companies had reported false profits for years. Banks had lent money recklessly. Investors had bought shares with borrowed money they could never repay. The entire financial system had been built on a foundation of fraud and wishful thinking. When confidence disappeared, the structure collapsed instantly. What had seemed permanent revealed itself as a fantasy. Banks began to fail. Small banks in rural areas closed first. Farmers lost their savings overnight. Then city banks started falling. Bank runs spread like disease. Word would reach a neighborhood that a bank was in trouble. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. This rush made the bank fail faster. The failure frightened depositors at nearby banks. Those banks collapsed too. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks failed across America. 9,000. Businesses closed by the thousands. Without credit, companies could not operate. Without customers, stores shuttered. Without stores, workers lost jobs. Without jobs, workers stopped buying. Each failure caused more failures. The economy fed on itself in reverse. The unemployment rate that had been 3% in 1929 climbed to 8%, then 15%, then 20%. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers had no job. In some cities, the rate reached 50%. The human cost arrived slowly and then all at once. Men who had worked their entire lives found themselves standing in breadlines. Professionals, skilled craftsmen, factory workers, all standing together waiting for a bowl of soup. The humiliation was total. American culture had taught that poverty was a personal failure. Now millions of people who had done nothing wrong found themselves destroyed. The shame was immense. Many never recovered emotionally, even after the money returned.
Hunger became ordinary. Families who had never missed a meal began rationing bread. Mothers gave their portions to their children. Children went to school dizzy from hunger. Teachers noticed students who could not concentrate, not from laziness, but from starvation. Some schools began feeding children breakfast because they arrived unable to function. A wealthy nation was starving its own people. Evictions filled the streets. Families who could not pay rent found their furniture piled on the sidewalk. Landlords had no choice or no compassion, depending on who you asked. Thousands of families slept in parks. They built shacks from scrap wood and cardboard in empty lots on the edges of cities. These settlements grew into communities. People called them Hoovervilles, after the president who they blamed for their suffering. By 1932, there were Hoovervilles in every American city. Men left home looking for work. They rode freight trains across the country, jumping from boxcar to boxcar, moving toward rumors of jobs that usually did not exist. An estimated 2 million people rode the rails during the Depression. They formed a shadow society with its own culture, its own language, its own dangers. Railroad police called bulls beat and killed hobos. Younger riders, some barely teenagers, learned to survive through theft and charity. Women held families together through impossible circumstances. They stretched pennies in ways that required constant creativity and exhaustion. They sewed clothes from flour sacks. They canned vegetables from backyard gardens. They took in boarders, did laundry for neighbors, sold handmade goods. The work of survival fell primarily on women, while the cultural narrative focused entirely on unemployed men. Women's labor was invisible and essential. Children lost their childhoods. Many dropped out of school to work. Boys sold newspapers or shined shoes. Girls helped with household labor or found domestic work. Some families sent children to relatives because they could no longer feed them. An estimated 200,000 children wandered the country alone, looking for food and work and family. These were not criminals or runaways. They were victims of an economic system that had broken down completely. Crime changed character during the Depression. Some crimes increased as desperation grew. Petty theft exploded. People stole food, coal, clothing. Judges and juries often refused to convict men and stole bread to feed their families. But organized crime adapted and thrived. Prohibition created fortunes. Gangsters like Capone employed thousands in cities where legal employers had vanished. The criminal economy provided jobs and structure when the legal economy had none.
The political system cracked under the pressure. President Herbert Hoover believed the economy would correct itself. He opposed direct government relief, fearing it would destroy individual character and initiative. While Americans starved, Hoover insisted that prosperity was just around the corner. The phrase became a bitter joke. The president lived in the White House and gave speeches about American strength while the country collapsed. Business leaders who had caused the crisis tried to avoid blame. Bankers who had approved fraudulent loans disappeared into retirement. Executives who had manipulated stock prices faced no consequences. The men who had destroyed the economy lost their bonuses but kept their mansions. Working people who had trusted the system with their savings lost everything. The injustice was visible and enraging. America's faith in its institutions suffered damage that took decades to repair. Franklin Roosevelt arrived in 1933 promising to try anything. His New Deal was not a single plan, but 100 experiments. The government would act, the government would employ, the government would regulate. Whether it worked mattered less than the fact of its existence. For the first time, the federal government acknowledged responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. This was a revolution disguised as practical policy. The New Deal created work through force of will. The Civilian Conservation Corps put 3 million young men to work planting trees and building parks. The Works Progress Administration employed 8 million people, building roads, bridges, schools, post offices, and airports.
Writers documented American life. Artists painted murals in public buildings. Photographers traveled the country recording the Depression. The government paid people to create, to build, to exist with dignity. But the New Deal had enemies. Business leaders called Roosevelt a communist. Conservative politicians fought every program. The Supreme Court struck down major pieces of legislation. Wealthy Americans organized against what they called socialism. Some plotted more extreme measures. A group of business leaders allegedly approached a retired Marine general named Smedley Butler with a plan to overthrow Roosevelt and install a fascist government. Butler refused and reported the plot to Congress. The investigation went nowhere. The plotters faced no consequences. The poor fought back in their own ways. Workers organized unions despite violent opposition. Company owners hired private armies to break strikes. Police beat strikers in the streets. In 1937, workers at Ford Motors were ambushed by company security men in what became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Organizers were beaten badly. The violence was photographed and published nationwide. It turned public opinion toward the workers. The unions eventually won, but the price in blood was real.
The drought arrived as if the land had heard about the Depression and decided to join. For years, farmers on the Great Plains had plowed grassland that had never been meant for farming. The grass held the soil in place through drought and wind. When the grass was gone and the drought came, there was nothing left to hold the earth. The soil simply lifted off the ground and flew. Dust storms of impossible scale swept across the plains. In April 1935, a storm called Black Sunday turned day into night across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. The wall of dust was 60 miles wide and reached 2 miles into the sky. Animals suffocated. People choked on the dirt that seeped through every gap in houses. Children developed a condition called dust pneumonia. Doctors found their lungs packed with earth. Hundreds died. The Dust Bowl destroyed farming across 100 million acres. Crops that families had grown for generations withered and blew away. Land that had been worth money became worthless overnight. Banks foreclosed on farms they could not sell. Families who had homesteaded for decades, who had built homes and buried ancestors in the land, packed everything they owned into vehicles and drove west. California became the destination. 300,000 Okies, as they were called, refugees from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas, poured into California between 1935 and 1940. They had heard California had work. They had heard the fields were full of fruit waiting to be picked. What they found was different. California farm owners wanted cheap, desperate labor, but not permanent residents. Signs appeared. No Okies. Gas stations refused to sell to them. Towns set up borders to turn them back. The migrants lived in labor camps that were barely habitable. Tents in muddy fields. No sanitation. Children sick with diseases that clean water would have prevented. The richest agricultural state in America watched migrants starve while crops rotted in fields over disputes about prices and labor. The contradiction was total. Photographer Dorothea Lange drove through the camps and made photographs that still define the Depression in American memory. Her image of Florence Owens Thompson, the migrant mother, showed the world what the American dream looked like from the bottom. John Steinbeck drove through the camps and wrote The Grapes of Wrath. The novel told the story of the Joad family, Okies driven from their land and destroyed by California's agricultural system. The book sold millions of copies. California growers tried to ban it. Oklahoma burned it. The anger it generated proved that the story it told was true. Art became a weapon against the comfortable narrative that poverty was personal failure, rather than systemic crime.
Recovery came slowly, painfully, and incompletely. The New Deal reduced suffering, but did not end the Depression. Unemployment remained above 10% throughout the 1930s. The economy improved, but never fully recovered. It took a war to finally end the Depression. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and America began preparing for possible conflict, factories came back to life. Armaments needed building, ships needed constructing. The military needed feeding and clothing and equipping. By 1941, the unemployment rate had fallen dramatically. By 1943, there was a labor shortage. The same factories that had stood idle for a decade ran 3 shifts. Women entered the workforce in numbers never seen before. Black Americans found industrial jobs that had previously been closed to them, though discrimination remained brutal and constant. The war economy did what the New Deal could not. Full employment returned, but the cost was a world war. The Depression left scars that lasted generations. People who had lived through it never trusted banks again. They kept cash hidden in mattresses and walls. They saved everything, wasted nothing, feared debt with a visceral terror. The children of the Depression carried these habits into old age. Their children inherited the anxiety, if not the poverty. An entire generation was marked by the experience of watching a system they had trusted destroy them. The political landscape transformed permanently. Before the Depression, the federal government played a minimal role in American life. After it, government became the guarantor of basic security. Social Security created a pension system. The FDIC insured bank deposits. Labor laws protected workers. Regulations constrained banks. These programs survived for decades because the memory of what happened without them was too raw to forget. But the darkness also survived. The corruption that had enabled the crash adapted and continued. Organized crime that had grown during Prohibition found new industries after repeal. Unions that had fought for workers' rights developed their own corruption. The same patterns of power, greed, and exploitation that had created the Depression reassembled themselves in new forms. America fixed some of the mechanisms that had failed. The human tendencies that had broken those mechanisms remained unchanged. The story of the Great Depression is not really about economics. It is about what happens when the systems people trust to protect them fail completely. It is about the distance between the promises a society makes and the reality it delivers. It is about ordinary people absorbing extraordinary suffering with almost no help from the institutions that had claimed their loyalty. They survived.
They built the
Most of them.
post-war world on
The ones who didn't
foundations
left
of
no
Depression
monuments,
era legislation.
only numbers. Only the silent weight of lives that the roaring machine of American prosperity built up and then consumed without regret. The lights came back on. The factories hummed again. The breadlines disappeared. America told itself it had overcome its trial and emerged stronger. Some of that was true. Some of it was myth. The Depression ended. The questions it raised about power, wealth, and justice never did.